Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Per Capita's webinar series. This is our last for the year, and I'm thrilled that we're being joined today by Alan Kohler to discuss his new essay in the quarterly essay series, The Great Divide, Australia's Housing Mess and How to Fix It. The how is something we really like here at Per Capita, so it's good to see that. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands today of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Land being very much the subject of our conversation today. And I really, if you have not taken advantage of the special offer we brought to you with our friends at Black Ink, please do so. But if you have read the essay, you'll know that Alan takes a long view of the history of housing in our country, of our attitude towards it, and about why we are now a less egalitarian country because of what's happened to housing. So let me introduce Alan. Alan will be known to all of you, I'm sure, as the finance presenter on the ABC News, and he writes currently for The New Daily and Intelligent Investor. He's a former editor of The Age and the Australian Financial Review, and he founded Eureka Report and Business Spectator. He's written for The Australian, AFR, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. His books include It's Your Money and this latest essay in the quarterly essay series. Alan, thanks so much for joining us today.
The pleasure, Emma. It's good to be here.
And I'll just remind everybody that we are recording this. It'll be available on our website later. If you'd like to put a question to Alan at the end, please post that in the Q&A and I will keep an eye on that and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Also here visible on your screen is Matt Lloyd-Cape, my colleague at Per Capita, who's the director of our Centre for Equitable Housing. And the research he's been doing this year aligns very neatly with a lot of the arguments that Alan has set out in this really well-written essay. What made you want to write this, Alan?
Oh, well, the simple answer is that they asked me to, I guess. They contacted me and said, would you like to write a quarterly essay on housing? And I thought about it for a few days and thought, yeah, that'd be a good idea. I'd like to do that. And set about doing it.
Well, they couldn't have chosen someone better, I think. You've, as I said, it's not only very readable, coming from a journalist, but takes a long view of Australia's attitude to housing, attitude to land and property, really. Why did you start right back where you did? You looked at the settlement of our country, the invasion of our country, and some of those early exchanges of land. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, Australia is not an old country. It's fairly young, a couple hundred years old. And I think the founding of the country with English settlement was recent enough to have influenced our attitudes today. And I kind of wanted to delve into what I see as the paradox of Australia's attitude towards land, which is that there's tons of it. And we kind of, our cities have sprawled with large blocks, single dwellings on each block, very unusual kind of setup. But at the same time, we have this attitude that housing is the way to create wealth, and that it's scarce enough for that to happen. And so I just kind of thought that this was an interesting paradox, really, as to in Australia's attitude to housing, and I wanted to investigate it. So I kind of read about, tried to understand the early days, and everyone kind of knows that in the first sort of 50 years of Australian settlement, land was just handed out to whoever the governors wanted to give it to, or whoever actually went and set up a place and started running sheep. So it was kind of, based on the idea that there was no one here before, and England owned the place, the whole place, and just started dishing it out. And then I think the other big event, after the settlement, was the gold rush in the 1850s. Obviously, what happened was the population exploded as everyone came here to find gold, and then there was a baby boom in the 1860s, which led to the fact that a whole lot of people became adults in the 1880s and started looking for a house to live in, and so there was a boom in housing. And actually, it was fairly scarce. So the price the price of housing took off. So, and I think, and I know I've been reading a fair bit of the newspapers at the time, and the attitude in the late 1880s was that housing was the sure way to build wealth. And so we had, within the course of 100 years, this idea that housing was free, or sorry, not housing, land was free, and then land was scarce and was the way to build wealth. And I do think those two ideas have persisted, within us since then.
I agree, and we're now reaping the long results. You also, I think, you open the essay with your own family history and what, comparing your experience as you self-described yourself as a boomer. I don't like these labels, but that's what they are. But compared to your parents, and then looking at your children's generation, and it's a really a neat way, I think, of showing us just what's changed in a couple of generations. I think your parents, give us a little background there. They bought a block of land and built a house in Melbourne.
Well, just before I do that, I'll just background. What I wanted to try to do was to, and the reason I wanted to do the essay really was firstly to investigate what has actually happened to house prices, because I think in all the discussion about housing affordability is it's all been a bit loose in my view. It hasn't been precise about what exactly has happened to house prices, and then to investigate why it had happened. And then I thought that if I did that and did those two things thoroughly, then the solutions might actually present themselves. So anyway, we'll get to that. So then I thought, okay, well, let's look at what's gone on through my own family. And so my parents bought a block of land in 1951 with a war service loan. Dad built the house. So look, and the thing is, I don't know what he paid, and I don't know what he was earning then, but I do know I was able to find out that the average price in Australia of a house and land package in 1951, early 50s, was around about £1,250, and the average salary was around about £350 a year. So it was 3.5 times, and I think probably that's kind of where my parents were at as well. And so that is to say, house prices in the early 50s were 3.5 times average incomes. And when my wife and I bought our first house in 1980, we also paid around about 3.5 times our income for the house. And that was, at that time in the 80s, also the average multiple of house prices to incomes. And I've got 3 kids. They've, in the last few years, all bought houses, got married, had kids themselves, bought their first houses. And I worked it out for all of them. And the answer was 7 to 8 times. They paid 7 to 8 times their income, household income, for the house. And that is the average, the national average. And so basically what's happened is that house prices have doubled as a multiple of incomes. And, that's a big deal.
That is a huge incomes, yeah?
That's right. That is a huge change. Huge change. It's actually a little bit, how can I put it, distorted by the fact that household incomes now include much more of both partners working. Whereas, when my parents started out in 1951, it was only Dad who worked. So the household income then was Dad's salary, and the household income now is usually full-time salary for one person, part-time salary for the other. And so this 7 to 8 times that I've worked out is based on average weekly earnings for one full-time, and average weekly earnings for one 3 days a week, and the median house price is 7 to 8 times that. So look. I mean, and so the other thing I kind of wanted to find out was, was this change a gradual one over the past, 75 years, or was it, did something change at a particular point in time? And it's quite clear that the time that it began to change was the year 2000. So we can get into that.
Let's get into that now.
As you wish.
Yes, well, I think that was one of the things that struck me immediately. I mean, it's on page 3 of the essay, is that graph, which looks very much like one that we've produced at the Centre for Equitable Housing as well. But just before we do, I want to emphasise that point to anyone here. It's, if you think about the value of the home in return for the hours worked by that household, the growth is even bigger, because women are effectively going into the workforce over this period. And all of that additional 3 days a week of paid labour is going towards house prices. So it's really, so what did happen in the year 2000? I mean, we know.
Well, up until the year 2000, house prices and wages and GDP all increased at roughly the same percentage per year, which was around about 3%, give or take. And then after the year 2000, house prices started rising at an average of 6% per annum, which is what's led to the multiple now being 7 to 8 times incomes versus 3 to 3.5 times incomes. So there was a change in 2000 at the rate at which house prices increased per annum, from 3% roughly to 6% per annum. So the question is, what actually? Okay. I kind of, well, what happened in 2000? And there's only one thing that happened, which is in September 1999, the Howard government halved the capital gains tax by changing the way that capital gains tax is calculated from being inflation adjusted, so that from 1985, when the capital gains tax was introduced, basically what happened was, from that time, you added the capital gain to your income for tax purposes, minus the impact of the consumer price index for the years that you owned the asset. And in September 1999, that was chucked out, and they brought in instead a straight out discount whereby you only paid tax on half of the capital gain. And the argument, there were two lots of arguments. One was that this would encourage investment in companies and productive sort of endeavours. And secondly, it was kind of the argument was that it was roughly the same as the inflation adjustment, given the way inflation was at the time and the average time that people held the house. So the thing is that we weren't interested in investing in shares or anything else. Australians are interested in investing in housing, so that's what they did. And secondly, inflation was pretty high at that time, and it fell. So it's no longer the case that a 50% discount on capital gains tax roughly equates to an inflation adjustment. That's not the case. Do you want to get into any of that in more detail?
Yeah, I mean, it's really striking, and an argument that we've been making ourselves. So seeing it set out so clearly here is gratifying, because I remember it. I remember Peter Costello standing up and announcing that change. Yes, I'm that old, folks, and saying that this would drive investment into our productive economy. But that's not what's happened. It's all gone into land prices, effectively. Can you explain to our audience how that change to the capital gains tax interacts with our negative gearing regime? So how it encourages people effectively to take a prolonged loss on an investment in pursuit of that capital gain.
Yeah. So the negative gearing situation in Australia it's always been the case that you got to deduct any losses from an investment against your other income. So, in the case of a house, if the mortgage repayments on the house are higher than the rent you're getting, that's a loss, and you get to deduct that against your salary, from your salary for your tax return purposes. And that was always the case. But the thing is that that really kind of was supercharged by, or the appeal of that tax deduction was supercharged by the discount on capital gains tax. And one of the graphs I've got in the essay shows the amount of negative gearing deductions from data from the tax office, which exploded after 2000. I mean, it was not much. People weren't using negative gearing too much before that. because you've got to pay full capital gains tax, and nobody really was that interested in that. And after 2000, when capital gains tax was discounted by half, everyone jumped into it. So it became a huge thing. And now, I mean, the other thing I want to say about the capital gains tax discount is that it was also a huge psychological impact because nobody really understands inflation or CPI and how it works. I mean, what is CPI? Nobody gets it. And so really, there wasn't this kind of sense where people understood how it worked. But everyone understands a discount, 50% off. Everyone gets that. So that was what made it so appealing. Everyone kind of got it suddenly. And, and then the data is quite clear that that's what happened.
Yes, it is. And disastrously so. But as you pointed out earlier, the conversation around housing in this country tends to be loose, tends to be driven by particular vested interests. And so I think while we do want to acknowledge and foreground those demand side levers, we're not in the business of saying it's all demand or it's all supply. This is a wicked problem with multifactorial causes. So you do look at some of the planning, the history of the planning changes in the country, and you go back to Chifley's attempt to take the ability to set prices and control rents through a pretty resoundingly defeated referendum. The supply issue is the one that's being pushed at the moment, that it's all about we don't have enough houses. But as you said, we've got vast tracts of land. So what's gone wrong there?
Oh, well, what went wrong was the 2019 election, really. I mean, so the ALP in 2016 went to the election with a housing affordability policy, which was to reduce the discount on capital gains tax from 50 to 25% and to confine negative gearing to new houses only. And they did pretty well in 2016. They got a swing of 3.1% to them. They won 14 seats. And really, they almost won, despite having that policy, right? Or possibly because of having that policy. Who knows? Then Bill Shorten, I think, got a bit cocky, or not so much cocky, but he wanted to make sure in 2019, 3 years later, he wanted to make sure they won. And so he significantly increased their spending promises for the 2019 election and had to raise some more money to pay for them. So he kept the affordable housing policies, but he added a crackdown on dividend franking in 2019 and then lost badly. And the thing is that obviously he lost his job then and Anthony Albanese took over. And the thing is the ALP doesn't know why they lost in 2019. Was it dividend franking or was it negative gearing and capital gains tax? And because they don't know which one it was, they dropped everything. And so as a result of that, those tax changes to remove the tax incentives for investing in housing have become kind of politically toxic, and nobody wants to do it. I mean, certainly the coalition doesn't want to do it, and the ALP doesn't want to do it either now. And so whenever anyone officially in Canberra talks about housing, all they want to talk about is the supply, because doing anything really to reduce demand would be problematic. It would be painful in a sense. I mean, the other issue that would reduce demand would be to reduce immigration. And the government doesn't want to do that because the businesses are screaming for staff. And so, they want to keep that up. And also the federal government gets the benefit or kudos of immigration because it expands the economy, it expands GDP, and they are credited when the economy grows. And, the fact is that without population growth and immigration over the past 12 months to 2 years, we would have been in recession, and that would have been bad, having headlines saying recession. So the federal government doesn't want to reduce immigration, and they certainly don't want to reduce tax incentives on housing. So really, that's why everyone talks about supply, because it's easier and less of a political problem.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And I don't think it's bizarre to me that they're still more afraid of a headline that says that aggregate GDP isn't growing as fast as it should be than a headline that says we can't house our young people and children fleeing domestic violence. But choices and priorities. But we don't do supply particularly well in Australia either. You talk in your essay about decisions made after the Second World War compared to the UK, where we see quite a high rate of social housing in their system through housing trusts and so on, because they effectively nationalised their urban planning system following the war, but we didn't go down that path.
Well, we actually copied their zoning and zoning systems in the early 20th century. And when they changed to centralise it into the central government, we didn't follow suit. So really, I mean, that was 1942. I think it was the middle of the war. I mean, there was a bit of a distraction going on, but still, there's no excuse. And so zoning. I mean, one of the lines in the essay is that the federal government in Australia, the federal government is in charge of increasing demand for housing, and the states and councils are in charge of reducing supply of it, and that's kind of the way it works.
Talking about that period in our history, you one of the great things about this essay is that you just very gently break open a few myths about Australia's political history, and you talk about something that we feel really strongly is a big contribution to this problem, which is the lack of social housing construction, and its precipitous fall as a share of properties in the country. And even though, and that's one of Matt's favourite lines, that Menzies wanted to build a nation of little capitalists by creating more homeowners. And you argue that he shouldn't get the credit that he often does for having built or for having created that nation of homeowners, and that actually by world standards, we're really not that exceptional.
Oh, that's right. And I mean, what Menzies did was kind of two-sided, in the sense that he did promote home ownership, but it was for self-interested reasons, because he believed, possibly with some some justification, that renters voted Labor and homeowners voted Liberal, and so he wanted to make sure that there were as many homeowners as possible. And so what he did was he forced the states to start selling the public housing that had been built after the war. So following the war, when Ben Chifley was in charge, they created the Commonwealth Housing Commission. They started off with Commonwealth state housing agreements, where the Commonwealth was paying for the states to build public housing. And there was a huge amount of public housing built during that time. And it did continue after Menzies became Prime Minister in 1949, but not for long. And he started to force the states to sell that housing, firstly to the tenants, and then secondly to anybody who wanted them. And the idea simply was, as you said, to create what he thought was a nation of little capitalists. So, the idea of public housing, government-owned housing, government-built housing that is rented at favourable terms to people who need it, started to go away, and it was, I think, finally killed off by Malcolm Fraser. But the other thing that I think is kind of important in terms of what Menzies did was he embedded this idea that home ownership is good and renting is bad. And so, he kind of in many speeches talked about how it should be the great Australian aspiration to have a little plot of your own, and that nobody can kick you out of, and all this stuff. And so I think during that period, Australia really became very wedded to owning your home rather than renting, for long term, possibly for your life, as people do in Europe. And I think that it has in a sense, been a bit of a problem because the idea of ownership is difficult for everybody. Anyway.
And of course, we don't have the kind of rental market, partly because of the volatility of that sort of hobby landlord class. Anyone with a bit of extra money goes and sticks it in, or equity in their own home, borrows, invests in an investment property, takes a loss for 7 years, sells it, makes a capital gain. That doesn't create the conditions for a long-term stable rental market for people that might want to rent for their lives.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, I spent a bit of time, a few pages in the book, talking about pets.
Yes.
And how difficult it is to own a pet when you're a renter. And pet ownership in Australia is really high. Everyone loves pets. Everyone wants a dog or a cat. But there's not many houses that you can rent that allow it, which has kind of made it, which has increased demand for ownership of housing.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to bring Matt in soon because I do want to get on to we want to find solutions. Okay, it's a wicked and enormous challenge, I think, and you're right. You've rightly pointed out the political barriers to getting things done, but it's not too cynical of me to say I hope that if there's enough demand from the community, politicians will eventually find their way to do something that's in their political interest. So. I want to get on to how we, and that's one of the reasons we set up the centre here, how we can change that public conversation so that there is positive pressure to do something to address the housing market. But before I do that, I just wanted to invite Matt to jump in. Those of you who don't know Matt, he's the director of the Centre for Equitable Housing here at Per Capita and has been doing research all year in this space. Did we find, Matt, I just want you to talk a little bit about what we found in our Housing Monitor survey, because we're talking about community sentiment and that needs to shift before politicians will shift. Do you think we're seeing a shift away from some of these long-held views? And did you want to discuss that with Alan?
There's certainly an appetite for more political reform in the community than I would have thought before doing the survey. So when we asked people about their concerns about the current housing system, we saw enormous levels of concern, particularly among younger voters, as you'd imagine. But at the margins, and maybe important margins, there was significant differences. So, for example, we asked swing voters how they felt about housing and how important housing was for determining their vote at the next federal election. And 80% of Labour swing voters put housing as a top tier concern, and 90% of people swinging away from the Libs had it as a top tier concern. So there's clearly the math, the arithmetic still isn't there for enough renters and aspirational homeowners to shift the dial yet. But even among those that own their home, there was fairly major appetite for reform, particularly around public housing construction, increasing Commonwealth rent assistance, and even among investors. And this is the thing with our investor class, is that our property investors, we have the majority, 75% of them just own one investment property. And their thoughts on what should be happening in terms of rent stabilisation policies, in terms of taxation, like negative gearing reform, was much closer to the general population, which was generally approving, than your sort of professional landlords with 5, 6, 7 rental properties on their books. So it did feel to us, doing that piece of research, that there's more of groundswell of support for change, because people are seeing it with their kids and their grandkids. They're seeing these issues developing, and they either ring fence themselves and say, well, I'll guard my slice of the housing market as tightly as possible and try and negatively gear as hard as possible. But I think at the same time, there's a whole bunch of people that are saying, well, we do accept that there is going to have to be some sort of reform.
I actually think that if the Labor Party had gone to the 2019 election without the dividend franking crackdown, they would have won. And this is with just the affordable housing policy of confining negative gearing to new housing and halving the capital gains tax discount. If they'd gone to the 2019 election with just that, Bill Shorten would now be Prime Minister. And Anthony Albanese would be dealing with NDIS. And there would, and those policies would have been implemented.
Yeah, and I think the scale of the cost that we're going to see in the coming years from negative gearing and CGT may shift that public perception even more. We've been compiling all of the costs of negative gearing and CGT back as far as we can, and in the 80s and 90s, negative gearing costs from property investors cost around $1.5 billion a year in today's money. And in the years between the introduction of the CGT discount and the GFC, the global financial crisis, that increased to $11 billion. It's an incredible takeoff. And that's set to increase again as the effect of the interest rate rises comes through.
Thanks. Yep. And I agree, Alan. I think people understood the home affordability tax policies in 2019. They'd had them explained to them for years, and there was broad support for restricting negative gearing to new builds. But then they dropped the franking credits tax in the middle of that, didn't explain it properly, and everything went off the rails. Let's move on to, because you talk about what the government has done, this current government, since it came in, Alan, and you point out that even though the most recent parliamentary report on housing affordability by the former MP Jason Falinski had two tribes, very clearly two tribes, the supply side being the coalition, then government's view, and the demand side being the Labor Party in its dissenting report, that everything the government's done since it came to power, not long after that report dropped, has been about supply.
Well, yeah, it's because they lost in 2019. And, as I said before, they don't know why they lost. So that was the end of that. I mean, what they have done, the government has done, is broadly pick up the central recommendations of that report on supply, which is to pay bounties to the states to induce them to release more housing lots of $15,000 per lot. I mean, so there was, at first there was a Commonwealth State Housing Accord, which was last year, 2022, in August, where they all had a meeting and agreed to that they would try to get 1 million houses built over the subsequent 5 years. And then this year that was increased to 1.2 million through the application of these $15,000 bounties that would be paid, capped at $3 billion, which equals 200,000 houses over 5 years. So that was the idea. I mean, the thing is, firstly, if you add up the number of houses that were built in the 5 years leading up to the pandemic, it was 1 million, roughly. And so all they were promising to do, or saying that they would be able to do, was to get it back to what it was. And, I mean, I actually have been encouraged a bit by the response of the states to the $15,000, because they all seem to be scrambling to get it. I mean, they're so desperate for money, the states, that, they'll kind of do anything for it. So they are releasing a lot of lots to be built. The trouble is that state politicians don't build houses. Developers and builders build them. And the trouble is, at the moment, the cost of building a house have gone through the roof. And also builders are going broke like 9 pins. I mean, I saw a thing this morning saying that 30% of builders now are operating with negative cash flow. I mean, crikey, housing approvals are in decline at the same time as immigration is taking off. So they can kind of whistle up 1.2 million lots for all they like, but this doesn't mean that they're going to get houses built on them.
And we know that developers land bank and wait until the conditions are more favourable. So, yeah, it would seem to have landed in a policy with good intentions that's landed in a reality that's not going to result in very much. And I think your general appraisal of the approach, again, aligns with ours. You talk about the National Housing and Homelessness Plan consultation was released recently. I think we, like a lot of housing academics around the country, were pretty disappointed with its scope. And as you note in your essay, it doesn't really look at demand side issues at all. But I think most critically, you make the point that it treats housing as a welfare issue rather than an economic one.
Well, and that's right, and it kind of is a welfare issue. But the trouble is that the housing portfolio at a federal level sits within the Social Services Department, and the new plan that Julie Collins is in charge of is basically being conducted by the Social Services Department, and is therefore being treated as a welfare issue. And so it is that. But I mean, the fundamental problem that we've been talking about of the doubling of house prices versus incomes is not a welfare. That is an economic issue that affects the economy of Australia and affects the society generally, not just not just the lower socioeconomic end of the society. So, look, I think that they've got the wrong end of the stick. It needs to be approached as an economic issue and dealt with in that way, while at the same time ensuring that those people who are homeless. I mean, look, I don't understand how come we don't see housing as an essential service or essential good in the same way that we regard say telecommunications as an essential. So that with telecommunications, there is something called the universal service obligation that is imposed on Telstra, and they have to provide telecommunications to everybody. It's part of the deal. And likewise, electricity and gas and, petrol and water, they're all essentials, right? And the ACCC gets involved in regulating the price. Government gets involved in making sure that it's supplied. I mean, when Optus, well, this is, I mean, as a separate thing, Optus's network went down a couple of weeks ago, and it was absolute disaster, right? I mean, it was catastrophe and headlines everywhere, and the CEO had to quit. And but apparently, housing isn't an essential. Well, I reckon it is, right? And so, therefore, there shouldn't be any homeless people in this country.
Right.
I mean, how come we've got homeless people? It's just crazy. Anyway.
In a country as wealthy as ours, it's not just crazy, it's criminal, actually. It's
well, that's right. That's right. I mean, housing, surely, the roof over your head is an essential, and the government should see as its responsibility to ensure that everyone's got a house or somewhere to live. I mean,
and yet we've willfully abrogated that responsibility. I think it's been, as you outline in your essay, and I really do encourage everyone to read it. I've read it twice, very easy read, and really sets things out clearly. And while Australia's had its own unique challenges in its attitude to land, a big part of this too has been the dominant economic frame of the last 50 years that says shrink government as much as possible, let the market deliver. And we've allowed that to go to extremes in the housing sector. And surely, if there is ever a market that requires government intervention, it's providing shelter. So why, and for example, you talk about the way that bank products are offered in the US, the Fannie Mae and the Freddie Mac banks that can service low-income households. As Matt's pointed out in a lot of his work, the average, the typical length of a fixed-rate mortgage in America is up to 30 years. In the UK, it's 5 to 10 years, and yet here we can get a 2-year fixed-rate mortgage at best. The government is not only not offering other financial products to fix that market failure, but they're not acting as a non-market provider in the housing space either, which is what that investment in social and public housing after the Second World War started to do.
Yep.
So it's really a call for government to step in.
Totally.
Yeah.
And look, I do think that there are occasionally things that where the government should do stuff that isn't necessarily popular. It shouldn't be a matter of, I mean, I think the work you're doing on trying to find out if there's a groundswell of support for, affordable housing policies is fine. But sometimes the government has to do stuff where there isn't a groundswell, right? I mean, they just like, here is something that is not necessarily popular. Well, I think it is though, but anyway, they think it's not. So, but sometimes you've got to do things that are the right thing to do rather than the popular thing to do. And that's what I think is required here.
And I think we've lost that. People feel that we've lost that capacity through successive governments of all stripes at the federal level, certainly. It's interesting to me that there was a lot of surprise among certain parts of the political class when the Andrews government was returned so overwhelmingly last year in Victoria. If you ask people why, it's because love him or hate him, he was getting things done, right? And people actually reward you for doing things. They want governments to do things. That's why they're there. But we've lost somehow that ability in all our leaders to say, well, this is the right thing to do for the country, and then to explain why it's the right thing to do and persuade people. So do you think there's noting that we might try and persuade them that the views are changing in the community and it's not such a dangerous thing to do, but it will always be a scary thing to do because, as you point out, it requires talking about tax. And we seem to have lost the ability to make the argument that we should raise taxes to provide services. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Oh, I'm pessimistic, but look, I think that perhaps we can get into solutions now. I mean, I devote the last chapter to solutions, and kind of as I thought about it, I thought, well, actually, too much of the discussion about solving Australia's housing affordability has focused on the actual specific answers rather than dealing with the big picture. And I think that the problem fundamentally is there isn't yet a national consensus around the need to change it, or at least there's not an obvious one to the politicians in Canberra that there is a national consensus, whether there is or isn't. But I do think they need to firstly achieve that. And secondly, I think that there needs to be an aim expressed. With our climate change policies, for example, we have a target, 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050, and these are written in legislation, right? So they haven't just got the policy, they've actually written the target of the policy into legislation. And I do think that so the first step needs to be achieving a national consensus that there's a problem, it needs to be fixed. Second step needs to be, what's the aim of the policy? What are we trying to achieve? And my suggestion would be, and I the whole essay in a way is framed around that doubling of house prices to income ratio, which is the sort of fundamental core of the problem. So I think that the government should be starting to talk about that multiple, right? House prices have gone to 7 or 8 times incomes. That's bad. We need to get it back to what it was, or get it back to something or other. I mean, if they can't get their head around getting it back to 3 to 4 times, get it back to 5. I don't know. Pick a number, but I think it should be back to 3 to 4 times. I mean, was that for ages? This last 23 years is just an aberration. We need to restore house prices to what they were in relation to incomes. That's my view. And so, okay, then the government, so let's just picture a government of the future saying, okay, everybody, what we need to do is get the house price to income ratio back to 3 to 4 times. How do you do that? Well, first, either you've got to reduce house prices by half, or you've got to keep house prices where they are so that incomes can catch up. And obviously you don't want to reduce house prices by half because that would be catastrophic to the economy. When American house prices fell by 30% in 2006-07, there was a global recession and financial crisis. So we don't want that. Okay, so we're going to try to ensure that house prices don't change for a long time. How long would it take for incomes to catch up? The answer is 18 years. Mm-hmm. So this is at the current rate of income growth. Okay, so there you go, everybody. What we need to do is this is the government, this is what the Prime Minister should be saying to everybody. What we need to do, everybody, is to try to ensure that house prices don't go up for 18 years. Now, when I tell that to my kids, that's what we need to do. If there was going to be a sensible policy, it would be to do that. They're absolutely horrified at the idea. So anyone who owns a house, not just people who've just bought them, but anybody, which is 2/3 of the country, would not be in favour of that, of house prices not going up anymore, right? I mean, that would be unpopular because everyone likes talking about housing affordability as being a problem and they want to do something about it. But okay, do you want your house to not change in value for 18 years? And the answer is no, I don't want that at all. I want my house to go up.
Yes. Yep.
And so everybody's in that boat. Well, then, okay, so that's where political leadership comes in, right? So that's going to be a really difficult sell for the politicians to do. They have to persuade people. So I think the whole job of housing affordability is not particularly academic or research-based. It's persuasion-based.
Yeah.
The people of Australia have to be persuaded that this is a good idea to try to ensure that house prices don't go up. Because if we got the average increase in house prices down from 6% per annum, which it's been for the last 2 decades, to 3% per annum, or 3 to 4% per annum, then the current state of housing unaffordability would be locked in, right? The house prices would stay at 7 to 8 times income, and I don't think we want that.
We don't.
Well, I don't think the society wants it. I mean, individuals want it. This is the problem. I mean, I own a house. Do I want it to not go up for 18 years? Well, yeah. I'm a very
You're a very altruistic man.
altruistic person, but so I'd cop that, but a lot of people wouldn't.
A lot of people wouldn't.
So I think that the job is persuasion. Really, that's the job.
It is.
I mean, this is the thing. You see, we all talk about supply. Are we going to increase supply? We're going to do this to zoning. We're going to do this to council applications. We're going to have better trains, so we can open up more land. We're going to change the tax system. But what we don't talk about is, what are we trying to achieve with that? What's the aim? And the answer must be to ensure that house prices don't go up.
That's right.
For 2 decades, right? Well, that is a tall order, I reckon, to get everyone to agree to that.
It is a tall order, but as you say, when you look at the crisis and the way that it's affecting, unless you own your own home now, basically, and pretty much unless you got into the market more than 5-10 years ago, it's affecting your security, your ability to build a life. Even if you're a renter, you can't guarantee you're going to have a lease for more than a year or two. How do you have children and put them into the local school with confidence? So do you think that, and I'll come to some questions from the audience in a second, but my last question, do you think that the shift now, that as people, start to build more wealth in superannuation, so for that class of people, housing isn't the only wealth anymore, and B, start to see, well, I want my house to go up, but I'm going to have to either sell it or use all my super to get my kids a house deposit, that equation, that wealth effect that our house gives us, that feeling of security of it going up all the time, people might start to see that in more context?
Yeah, maybe. I hope so. That I think there's something in that. I think everyone's got a fair bit of super now, and I think that's changing. There's going to be starting to change attitudes. So yeah, I mean, I hope so.
Well, I think your essay is a very great first step in the task of persuading people to think a little differently about the value of their home. I will go to some questions from the audience because we could have kept going on this all day and we've only got about 10 minutes left. Richard McLaughlin asks, you talk about the change in capital gains tax discount for investment property, but what about the 100% capital gains tax discount on the principal residence, which allows endless flipping, over investment in renovation and construction, and capital gain totally tax-free? The shibboleth of the family home, Alan.
Yeah, well, look, I think that's true. It's a problem. It'd be better if it was taxed a bit, but it's not going to be. So let's just move on. So look, I think it's important in this discussion to not waste time talking about stuff that's not going to happen.
Couldn't agree more. It's our mantra at Per Capita. We want bold change, but achievable change. James has an interesting question. Don't have his surname. Just says he notices you have capital on your bookshelf just over your right shoulder, like all people interested in our economy should have. Was there any inspiration around Piketty's theories about returns to capital and concentration of wealth when you wrote this quarterly essay piece?
Oh, I'm a Thomas Piketty apostle. I think he's great. So yeah, I've got a lot of inspiration out of his writing. It's fantastic. A lot of writing. I mean, there's tons of books behind me that have informed my views.
Absolutely. I think it was capital that so struck the Per Capita board about a decade ago that they decided to reorient the think tank specifically towards inequality, which is when I came in.
So, right. There you go.
Big influence on our thinking as well. Read it a couple of times because I'm a nerd. This is an interesting one from Bruce Dixon. Bruce, I'll do my best with this. I'm not sure I fully understand what you're getting at. Alan, is one possible solution to bring down the average house price, average household income ratio, by looking at the same issue? Okay. If we move tax deductibility from negative gearing to mortgage interest deductibility for first home buyers, would that reduce the ratio of house price to income? So effectively saying, well, okay, we won't allow you to negatively gear anymore. We'll take the same value of those tax concessions and give first home buyers the right to basically offset their mortgage interest payments against their income.
Oh yeah, I suppose. I mean, look, I'm not in favour of any schemes designed to assist people to buy housing, including first home buyer grants, and including the latest scheme from the government, the Help to Buy scheme, which involves the government coming in as a part owner of the house and allowing people to buy it with a 2% deposit. I mean. Well, I think these are all band-aids. I think these are band-aids. We need to deal with the fundamental wound and heal the wound rather than, trying to stick something over it.
And we've stuck so many band-aids on this wound over the years that and a lot of them become infected and make things worse, frankly. Like first home buyers grants, they just push up the price of housing.
Yeah.
Hugh Belfridge. Hugh is one of the principals at the VNF Housing Enterprise Foundation that supports our work at Per Capita, so I should let him his question through. He says, Alan, supply that reduces scarcity and addresses our real housing needs would improve access to housing, including by putting downward pressure on price. It's unlikely that this will be delivered by the market, by developers and investors, because of that impact on price. And there are also significant capacity constraints in the housing sector. In this context, what changes, incentives, role of government and other policy changes do we need to create true supply that meets people's needs, including by institutional providers?
Well, so in the essay, I kind of came to went through a similar thought process and thought about, the discussion about the need for an increase in medium density housing in the suburbs, and a lot of the discussion about extra supply, either from the government or anybody else, is to do with well located housing. So there's no point having it not well located. So the trouble is that I'm pessimistic about the ability of either the market or the government, in fact, to come up with enough medium density housing in the suburbs, given the fact that so many people live on large blocks in single dwelling, and that's just the way Australia is, and it's going to be very difficult to change that. I mean, there are a few spots where you can build some medium density housing, and we all see it as we drive to work or drive around. So there are apartment blocks going up. I just don't think it's enough. So which is why in the essay I come down to the idea that really we need to open up land outside the cities using better transport infrastructure, better trains, so that the viable commuting distance is no longer 50 k's, but 100 or 150 k's from the city. And I mean, I suppose it would be good also if there were more jobs that weren't in the city and people didn't have to commute, which is a kind of a decentralisation argument. I note in the essay that there have been attempts over 100 years to create decentralisation in Australia, and none of it's ever worked. But that doesn't mean it can't ever work. But it would require a lot of attention, a lot of effort on the part of governments to ensure that to encourage companies to locate their operations somewhere else. So look, decentralisation, yes. I think the best thing would be that you can live on the other side of Geelong and get to the city in less than an hour by train, and it's a nice train journey. I mean, part of the problem, well, it's not a problem, but I wrote the solutions at the end of the essay after a short trip to Italy, where I spent some time riding around the trains in Italy, and they're magnificent. God, they were fast, efficient, nice trains. I came back thinking, oh, that's the answer. Crikey, just need to get from Rome to Milan and not very far, not very long, you know. So we need to. I thought, oh, well, you know, you really need to be able to get from Bathurst to Sydney in, you know, in quick time, so that you can live there and still get to the city.
Hmm. And particularly given, you know, our connectivity these days. I mean, I had a former staff member at Per Capita who used to commute in from Castlemaine to Melbourne, and we counted his commute time as part of his workday because he had Wi-Fi on the train and he got a lot done. So that
Yeah, well, the companies are all whinging about that now. They're demanding that workers come back into the office, but you know.
That kind of attitude might need to change as well. But I was in London, in England, when both national parties, both the Tories and the Labor Party, they had their national conferences, and all of the debate was about them cancelling the leg of the superfast train from Birmingham to Manchester. And at the same time, I'm bootling around London on the underground thinking, imagine if they'd done a cost-benefit analysis of the tube in the 1800s, it wouldn't be here now, you know. Just
Well, exactly. That's right.
Yeah. And we're having the same debate here in Victoria about the suburban rail loop. You know, people are very against it because it wasn't tested properly, it wasn't developed properly. And I was,
yeah, but I'm not a big urban planner, but I wonder about the suburban rail loop and all. You know, it's going to be billions and billions of dollars just connecting the suburbs. I mean, we need to. These trains need to radiate. It seems to me.
Yes,
rather than go around the suburbs.
Yeah, but we don't seem able to have a conversation about building what we need to build. It seems to me that governments either feel the need to do it in a clandestine way because otherwise it will be torn apart, and that leads to bad outcomes too. But you know, it just really struck me that I was in the UK on the amazing underground, and the current talk was, well, we can't build a train anymore to Manchester that invented trains. Anyway, I will stop dominating this and just take one more question from the chat. So this is a good one to finish on, I think, from Charlie, and refers back to Piketty again. Piketty might argue that big change doesn't happen gradually, that there need to be points of revolution. Do you have a moment of reckoning? Do you think we have a moment of reckoning coming on this issue, or do you think gradual improvement on housing is possible?
Look, to be honest, I hope there isn't a moment of reckoning, because that would mean that that the house price to income ratio had doubled again. You know, it had just kept going, and in 20 years' time, you know, it got to the point where there was, you know, a revolution or a moment of reckoning, and I think that would be bad. So it's far better if the current crop of politicians head that off and set about gradual change. You know. Through kind of some sort of slowdown and some sort of the things I've been talking about, you know, persuading people that it's a real issue, that we need to do it, setting about having a target, an aim of policy, and, you know, gradually getting there. Maybe, so, I mean, part of the problem is that whatever policy they come up with, it sort of has to fight against monetary policy and interest rates. And, you know, if interest rates started being cut again, then, you know, that would start to boost house prices again. I mean, we've had the house prices go up this year, even though interest rates have not been cut. House prices have gone back above where they were before they fell last year. You know, I mean, so look, I think, yeah.
We might get you back. We might get you back next year, Alan, and we'll have a much more general conversation about how monetary policy and the over reliance on it in recent years has become quite problematic, given that our capitalist markets no longer behaving according to a lot of the assumptions that they use to inform those policies. So that's a whole other conversation, but very relevant one. Thank you so much. I do think that this essay is going to be a great contribution to that persuasive conversation that we all need to have with our fellow Australians, because a country that can't house its own people has made some pretty bad decisions and has arrived in a place that is pretty indefensible, I think. At Per Capita and the Centre for Equitable Housing, we are advocating strongly for the Housing Minister to use the National Housing and Homelessness Plan as a vehicle through which to set that bold national ambition again, to say this is a problem, we're taking it seriously, and we're going to approach it as a nation. And I think until we see that happen, rather than these tinkering little bits and pieces here and there and a bit of blame shifting between different levels of government, that great correction that you say rightly that we need to bring house prices back in line with incomes is going to be hard to achieve. So everyone, please do take advantage of the offer from our friends at Black Ink. Thank you again, Alan, for your time and for writing this essay. It's as I said, I get all the QEs, but this one was one of the best I've read for a while, not just because I agreed with everything in it, but it's really well written and well set out. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Bye-bye.